Good evening, boys and ghouls! Get ready to scream, scream, scream! The Scarecrow Spookshow is here! There's giant monsters, spooky ghosts, mad science, body snatchers, sideshow oddities, weird aliens, and the usual vampires, werewolves, zombies, and so on. So tune in for the Scarecrow Spookshow!
Welcome, creepy creature kitties! This is your ghostly host and awful artist Aiden, and tonight we are doing a special creator commentary for The Scarecrow Spookshow. Now, I've done quite a few creator commentaries for my main comic series, Scapula, before, but tonight I'd like to focus on a comic which really deserves more love. If you'd like to grab a copy of The Scarecrow Spookshow, it is available exclusively in my online bookstore. Or join us in on Patreon at any level, and you'll be sent a special digital PDF copy of the first 3 chapters, which is what we're going to be looking at tonight. The Scarecrow Spookshow is appropriate for all ages, so if you creepy kitties have creepy little kitties of your own, this is the perfect place to get them started on something weird. The comics, not me, although you're going to be seeing quite a bit of me tonight. So let's begin with some horrorful history. Back in the year 2007, as I was developing my main comic series, the supervillain saga of Scapula, I was working on another comic alongside of it, which at the time was called Scarecrows. Scarecrows was about a retired horror movie host who has been, well, not so much retired as kicked out of the business, and now must adjust to normal life with the help of his grandchildren, no matter how many weird and strange things pop up in his life. I had a lot of love for this project because it went back to what inspired me to start drawing in the first place, which was the funny pages. Scapula had been intended for comic books, but Scarecrows was always intended for newspaper comics. I would not have started drawing in the first place had it not been for Bill Watterson's legendary Calvin and Hobbes, and soon after other comic strips started inspiring me as well. As Scapula was being sent off to publishers and rejected, the Scarecrow Spookshow, as it eventually became to be known, was being sent off to a lot of publishers as well, with similarly bad luck. Scarecrow Spookshow, it was something that I always wanted to reach out to larger publishers because I wanted this to end up in the hands of children. I was really hoping that Scarecrow Spookshow would give kids a lot of the inspiration that Calvin and Hobbes had given me. That's all well and good, except for sometimes the real world can be pretty brutal because everybody rejected this comic. To give you an idea of just how much hell this went through, 6 syndicates rejected it, 27 publishers of children's and young adult novels, as well as comic book publishers in general, rejected it. And in the 2008 DC Comics Zuda competition, Scarecrow Spookshow finished in 9th place out of 10. This comic took its lumps. Now, no matter how many times it was rejected, I kept on working on it all the way through. Now, normally this is the part of a story where the underdog prevails and victory is on the horizon, except for the fact that the horizon ended up having the year 2020 on it, when the entire world went to... Now, 2020 was a really hard year for all of us with COVID and the quarantine, and I finally said, okay, something needs to go right this year. I took a chunk out of my savings and funded a self-published run of the Scarecrow Spookshow book. Thankfully, a lot of people supported this comic, and half of the stock I ordered was sold out right when I made the announcement. So if you were one of the people who bought this book, especially if you bought it immediately, thank you so very much for keeping a happy smile on my face. So tonight, let's jump right into The Scarecrow Spookshow. Okay, let's begin. First of all, if you have an actual physical copy of the book, as I've been promoting for this entire video so far, wonderful, good for you. And if you are a Patreon backer and you're reading from the digital PDF version, you've been sent the first 3 chapters of this book, which we're going to be talking about tonight. So open up your PDF and we will begin with Welcome to My Spook Show. First things first is the artwork you're seeing here was originally going to be the front cover of the book. You know, just a nice happy image of the Baron and the 2 grandkids showing off props on the TV stage set, it works well enough. When I compared it, though, to a piece of promo art that was done much earlier, which actually had some action involved, it was obvious which one was going to be more eye-grabbing to potential readers. So I went back and forth and finally decided, yeah, go with the image that gets people's attention first and foremost. So even though this intended cover, I think, is drawn a little better because it was done much later on, it ended up becoming the interior cover instead. Which it works fine just there. Anyway, let's jump right into our first story of the evening, titled Baron Gets Fired. First of all, the layout of this book is a lot different from a lot of the previous Scapula material, which was typically done in magazine size. Scarecrow Spookshow from the get-go was conceived as sort of a 9-inch by 9.5-inch, something like that layout book, which was very much intentionally done to emulate, again, Calvin and Hobbes. This is what got me drawing in the first place, and a lot of what Scarecrow Spookshow was intending to do was kind of recapture what Calvin and Hobbes did for me, and hopefully, like even a tiny percent of that magic that Bill Watterson did has carried through with, my own silly little comics. Now, the other thing about the first 2 chapters of this book was, like I had mentioned in the introduction, this was originally intended for newspaper comics. So about 3 weeks worth of newspaper format material was sent off to syndicates, and that was the very earliest Scarecrow Spookshow material. If you are reading this in the PDF, this is all located towards the back. Now, unfortunately, this was not included in the print collection because of cost. Again, like I said in the introduction, this was entirely self-funded, no Kickstarters, crowdfunding, so I had to cut costs as much as I could, which means that only the stories themselves could be included. Now, I guess that's sort of the nice thing about doing the PDF for my Patreon backers is you guys are going to be able to see the pitches, the pitch comics I did, and you'll be able to see them in this video too, because the first 2 chapters are largely based on that pitch material. I'll be putting it sort of side by side along with the main pages. Now, there's not really too much to talk about the rougher early stuff, and I'll only really be bringing that up if it deviated from the story itself. So right off the bat, we have a TV title card and some music notes playing. Those music notes are exactly Toccata in D minor, Bach or whatever, whoever did that, which is probably like the most generic horror movie music you can imagine. You know how it goes. Just a cheap-ass title card for the Scarecrow Spookshow. Now, the first thing about this title is, this was not the original title of the comic. The comic was intended from the get-go just to be titled Scarecrows, which is a reflection on the Baron character, how something that looks scary isn't terrifying in the least, which is, a big part of the theme of the story and the character himself. When Scarecrows was submitted to the DC Comics for their Zuda competition, it was accepted, but the DC editor's only condition was the name Scarecrows could not be used, I think for copyright reasons, legal reasons, maybe it was offensive to actual scarecrows out there, I don't know, so I had to cough up a name on the spot and I just blurted out, Scarecrow Spook Show, and we went with that. In the original pitch reel, and in the rough version you're going to be seeing, the show, Baron Show, the show within the comic was called Screechorama Creature Feature, which is a very generic name. I don't know if the name Creature Feature is copyrighted or not, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but in the end I am glad I just changed the show itself to Scarecrow Spook Show, which actually makes more sense in world. WRM Channel 6 presents the Scarecrow Spook Show with your host, the Baron. Now let's meet our star of the night, the Baron himself, or Baron de Monte. The Baron was a character who I think was sort of the flip side of Scapula. Scapula is another horror-influenced character, but Scapula was always from the get-go. Scapula was very much based on a lot of my, let's just call them negative emotions, a lot of cynicism and anger and fear and hurt and whatnot. The Baron was the flip side of that, which was a lot of the love and a lot of the enthusiasm and energy that I had from my art and performing was meant to be captured with this character. Now, the Baron, of course, has a lot of inspirations, and a lot of them are horror-based. First and foremost, a lot of his appearance is based on horror superstar Vincent Price. This one is pretty obvious from his appearance with the pencil mustache. Vincent Price, yeah, very, very lovable personality, very talented actor, and I think a lot of that was kind of emulated here. The second inspiration for the Baron was Alice Cooper. I've mentioned Alice Cooper many times in Scapula and a lot of my performing because Alice, of course, is a horror superstar himself. Alice and the influence, you can see that a bit with Baron's nose and with the long hair, which I don't think a lot of people from Baron's generation would have, but I decided just to throw that in there as sort of an homage to Alice. Vincent Price and Alice Cooper are the obvious ones, and they've had a big influence on me. They had a big influence on the Baron. But the third inspiration was probably the biggest influence of all on this character, and that was horror host John Zackerly. Now, Zackerly I've talked a bit about in one of my drawing videos, and Zackerly, if you're not familiar with him, was the first horror host megastar. He wasn't the first horror host of them all. That credit probably goes to Melanermi Vampira, but Zackerly was the first horror host who made it big, and for my money, I think he was the most influential horror host of all time. There are so many, horror hosts who took a lot of inspiration from Zach, and Zach was a big part of, the fun, the bombastic personality, the cheesiness, if you want to call it that he brought to horror hosting. In my mind, when I was writing the Baron's dialogue, a lot of it was written in sort of that loud, deep, cheesy, baritone voice of John Zackerly himself. Good evening, boys and ghouls. The Baron's name is taken from an artist I have mentioned a few times in these commentaries, and that is Baron Story. Baron Story was a teacher of mine, and probably the only teacher who ever really cared about whether I lived or died or learned anything. I had to honor him giving this character his namesake. So a lot of those influences gelled together into what I had considered my perfect horror host in my head. Would love to do. Horror hosting's got to be an awesome thing. Except for when it ends. Now the Baron is into his act. Are you prepared for terror, fun, and fight? Then get ready to scream! 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 Cut cameras. Ratings are in, Baron. You've been cancelled. What we learn here is that the Baron is on a TV show set in a local television channel, and that is a very dated reference here in this modern age. Local television was, of course, a big part of entertainment history, but a lot of that was wiped out and eventually replaced with morons on YouTube. But it was very much important to horror, and it's very much where this comic takes place. The setting of this comic is another topic to talk about, but this comic does not take place in modern times. Obviously not with the kind of set and the props and the cameras that we're using here. And if you have a copy of the Scarecrow Spookshow book, it starts off with just a wee little hint about our world, and that is, years ago, a local broadcast station airs their midnight horror movie program hosted by the Baron. Now, when this book takes place, I never really wanted to flat out say when, but I'll tell you now, just for a little bit of mindset, the Scarecrow Spookshow takes place in the early 1990s. I'd say anywhere from 91, no later than 1993. I didn't want to flat out say when it took place, because number one, the retro craze has gotten a little nutso. We have the 70s craze going on, thanks to stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy, the 80s craze, which refuses to die, thanks to Stranger Things, and I was sort of afraid that if I had just flat out started the book saying, the year's 1991, people would go into the book expecting a lot of early 90s tropes like, fashion and music and stuff like that, and that's not what this book is about. Again, going back to Calvin and Hobbes, one of the many magical things about Calvin and Hobbes is that it has a very timeless quality to it, where it is sort of difficult within the comic itself to pin down the time period. Now, even though this was an 80s, 90s comic, it does not feel like an 80s comic, it does not feel like a 90s comic. There's a lot of elements in Calvin and Hobbes that almost place it in an earlier era. There are things like rotary phones and typewriters. The family didn't even own a VCR. Yes, a lot of those things were true in the 80s and even up until the 90s, but at the same time, Calvin and Hobbes just existed in its own world in its own time period, and I thought that was something that was very special about it. Let's jump ahead to page 2. We get our title, Baron Gets Fired, just done with the period. And we see a little more of this rundown TV station. There's a few things going on in the background, which is horror Easter eggs that I wanted to pepper in back there. We have the sort of husky guy in the back running the camera. The one with the beret is based on Karl Freund. Karl Freund was the director of The Mummy, Mad Love, and a few people suspect he was the actual director of Todd Browning's Dracula. On the next panel, we have the Filipino guy with the gorilla suit is based on Charles Gamora, who played a lot of apes in films like Murders in the Rue Morgue and the remake of The Unholy Three. And the gentleman putting on the makeup is based on Robert Harris in a very good film called How to Make a Monster, which I especially want to reference here. Also in the background, not really a horror reference, although it is a little horrifying, is a guy's pants falling down and another guy is just checking out his butt. This seems to happen quite a bit in my comics, and in like the Scapula series. Every now and then you just see a character just looking at someone's butt. You can't even call it a running gag because it's not a gag. It's just a butt is there and somebody's looking at it. I guess use what you know, use what's true to life. If I see an interesting butt, I'm checking it out. Oh boy, we gotta keep this age appropriate, don't we? Okay, getting back to our main characters in the foreground, we have the Baron. He's just really upset that the show's been canceled. I didn't want him to be egotistical or a prima donna. Maybe there's a little bit of that going on, but it's just him being an overdramatic ham, which I think is a big part of the character's appeal. Dude with the clipboard comes in and informs that yeah, times have changed, which is of course another big theme of this book is we were moving out of the local television host era. Baron is upset because, you know, like a lot of us old-timers, he doesn't really know how to change with the times, and he doesn't really know what's coming up next. What's coming up next is farting cats, anorexic models, and teens pulling pranks involving poo. Stuff like that. That's a little bit more of the later 90s. I guess that would have been stuff like, I don't know, was Jackass or that Punked show on the air by that, or was that the 2000s? I don't know if that is a good reference for early 90s or not, but whatever, that's the way the future was going, and Baron agrees that is much scarier. The scariest thing is now the Baron's career is over. You see the big guy back there carrying the box of snakes is based on Tor Johnson, who we remember from films like Bride of the Monster and Plan 9 from Outer Space, and etc, etc. I'm gonna make a lot of horror movie references tonight, so bear with me. Set's tearing down, and we leave the studio forever. We have a couple of environment panels here, and, you know, drawing environments, it's not always as much fun as drawing cartoony characters with wild expressions. You gotta show your readers where our stories take place. We open up with just a wide shot of a very small city in the mountains. It's not super important to the series, but the Scarecrow Spookshow takes place in a fictional town called Claytoad, which is up in Oregon. A big part of this reason is just because Oregon is very pretty, so because I wanted to move the action far away from where Scapula and my other comic series Dada Hyena takes place, which was San Francisco. We'll be talking a little bit about the fact that those comics do not overlap each other, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So we just have a quiet gray mountain town, and we move over to our household, which is where a lot of our stories are going to be taking place. Drawing perspective is not fun. I'm sure there's a lot of things you can nitpick about this. Thankfully, for a corner cutter like me, you only got to draw it once, and then you can recycle it a few times. Scapula readers know you've probably seen that exact same drawing of his waxy museum layer again and again, because I can only make myself draw it once. Oh, because drawing perspective is rough. Let's move on to page 3. Now inside our house, we have the Baron's little art studio. There's a lot of stuff in the background that if I went through one by one, it would take forever to get through. There's a lot of knickknacks and oddities, movie memorabilia, kind of Harryhausen models of prehistoric animals and mythical monsters and stuff like that. Coelacanth back there. We have the introduction of 2 other characters who are going to be very important to our dynamic, and that is Baron's grandkids. First of all, we have Baron's granddaughter, Giselle. Giselle was part of the original syndicated pitch packet, which I had sent around, and Giselle's role was of course meant to be sort of the comic foil to Baron, or sort of the straight man in their routine, where a lot of Baron's eccentric personality is offset by her standoffish goth demeanor. In the original pitch packet, Giselle's relationship with Baron was slightly different in that she was much older. In the pitch packet, Giselle was a college-age girl, and she was almost Baron's caretaker. I didn't like that dynamic because one of the things I wanted to do with the Baron was not to let him go too far off almost crazy personality. He needed to be grounded a little bit. One of the ways to do that was to make him a little more responsible, which was having him take care of the grandkids, or having him be more in charge, which I felt kept him from seeming more like one insane old out of control man who's got to be strapped down to a bed or whatnot. Don't do that to your old people unless they really have it coming. In the actual book itself, Giselle's age was dropped down to a high schooler. She's about 15 here, so that Baron has to look after her, but at the same time, when you're at that high school age, that shy, insecure personality that Giselle has sort of a passing resemblance to another comic character I had around that time, which is Christy McGough from the Dada Hyena comics. The big difference, though, is that Christy, of course, is very outgoing. out there in the world and out of her mind too, whereas Giselle is definitely more the polar opposite of that, very withdrawn, very insecure, and not having a ton of confidence, which she kind of hides behind sort of that, let's say, snotty person. Not too snotty, of course. Now, the other grandchild we have here is Dwight. Dwight was not part of the original pitch packet. Dwight was added in to add a bit more positive energy. I was a little afraid that Giselle's attitude towards Baron might seem a little too condescending or a little too much like contempt, and the way to balance that out was to have a kid involved who just thought Baron was the coolest guy ever. Something else I should point out is that Dwight's name is taken from actor Dwight Fry, best known as Renfield from Dracula and Fritz from Frankenstein. Dwight is a little bit based on myself at that age, and both appearance and personality, which we'll be seeing a little bit later. If they're carrying grandkids, they're gonna come in and see how Grandpa's doing. Little Easter egg, if you've seen the second panel right behind Baron, there is a red curtain with like monster masks hanging from it. That is another homage to How to Make a Monster. He's having a hard time right now, but like I said about that positive energy earlier on, a character like Scapula would be fuming or, breaking stuff, screaming at the world for screwing him over, whereas Baron, he's gonna try to move on and, be productive, be positive. What is Baron gonna do now as in the next stage of his life? He's gonna make creepy, ugly puppets. Booga, booga, booga! Scapula readers, don't worry, this particular puppet is not evil and mind controlling like another one I could mention. It is, however, very stupid looking. We have back here Baron is just having a little bit of fun with his grandkid, and that was, again, Dwight's purpose in the comic was just to have sort of a happy relationship with the old guy. Even though Giselle doesn't really want to. We have a truck from the station dropping off the last of Baron's props. Once again, there's Tor Johnson, but inside the truck is another horror legend that would be Rondo Hatton, the Creeper himself. Like Tor, he was another horror star who did not require makeup to play his roles. You can also see a guillotine back there, which is another Alex Cooper reference. We move down here, and we have the gorilla costume that we had seen earlier. Yeah, just a bit of a reflective moment as Baron looks back on his life and looks back on his career and the way things are going. Now, the younger generation who never really watched his show or really has a ton of interest in something that Baron was doing is going to look at it and just say, it's a smelly old monkey costume. But Baron himself knows Grungo was much more than that. The gorilla suits popped up a lot in classic horror movies. It felt like if the horror movie producer felt like their movie wasn't horrorful enough, they would add in one of two tropes. You'd either throw in a hunchback there, or you'd throw in a guy in a gorilla costume, I guess because they were easy to make and they just read horror movie. I'd imagine this gorilla costume was used quite a bit on his show. And gorilla costumes work anywhere. We move on. By now you've probably noticed the way the story is set up is very much like a collection of newspaper comic strips, which of course it was always meant to be. The sort of stop-go, gag rhythm might seem a little jarring if you're just reading this as a straightforward comic story, because it does feel like there's a lot of stops and goes. This never really bothered me because, again, if you collected newspaper comics in book format, you're used to that. You are used to just the, gag as you would read it once a day in the newspapers. And that doesn't really bother me so much. The other thing about that is that a lot of the appeal of newspaper comics was just spending time with these characters you liked. Sometimes you'd have overarching plots, and gags were a big part of newspaper comics. But the big part of the appeal was getting to see characters that you liked every single day like they were friends of yours. A lot of the appeal of newspaper comics was just spending time with characters on a daily basis, and that's what a lot of this first chapter is about. It's just getting to know Baron, Giselle, and Dwight. Hopefully that doesn't bother anybody out there, although I think that was probably a deterrent to some of the publishers who did reject Scarecrow Spookshow, but that's their loss. Again, that's not for everybody, and apparently it's not for Giselle either, although Baron himself is a little protective of those roots. Bat props and crocodile props and ghost props and things like that. Down here we have one with Dwight. Now, even though this is also set up very much like a daily newspaper comic just told in 3 panels, this was not in the pitch packet because, again, Dwight wasn't back there, but I needed to have a little moment with him just to let people get to know what kind of character he is. Dwight, as you can see here, is a bit panicky, a bit nervous, prone to anxiety attacks, and that's, of course, very much drawn from life, which was as a very panicky kid who was afraid of most everything that could potentially kill you, whether it existed or not. That is something I could relate to growing up, even if it is just stupid little rubber spiders. which are only incredibly deadly, not extremely deadly, so calm down there, kiddo. We move on to the next page, and we have a bit of a flip-flop with Giselle, just kind of showing what kind of a sibling she is. Anybody watching this who have siblings know that it is a lot of extremes with love and hate, and there's, you know, a lot of fun times, a lot of not fun times, and a lot of stupid times! Sorry, repressing stuff. So we have a sort of turn on the dime moment right here where Giselle is trying to comfort Dwight, trying to get him to calm down so he doesn't have an anxiety attack, but of course at the very same moment is teasing him about a blood-drinking moth living in the chimney.
So Baron tells a story about Mr. Creighton, who may have been a werewolf. Mr. Creighton's name comes from Creighton Tull Cheney, better known as Lon Chaney Jr., the Wolfman. He's one of my favorites.
I tried to throw what I had into drawing that sort of werewolf creature that's seen in the second panel there. Going back to Calvin and Hobbes, I think Bill Watterson said once that if any time he had to just press on ahead with a joke that was just not really up to his liking, he would go for broke on the illustration, which I tried to do here. I didn't want to entirely show the werewolf because, again, it's sort of a clash in styles, which was intentional, but I didn't want something like, you know, too horrifying or too realistic there because I didn't want it to contrast too much with what was going on. Now, a were-orangutan, that would be scary as you-know-what. There's the logic I was looking for. Let's move on. Again, we have a recycled joke from the pitch packet, but it starts off with something a little new, which is Baron just taking the cape out. That's not really important. Maybe it's just there for filler, but I mostly put it in there just to show a bit of animation with these characters. Now, the style of Scarecrow Spookshow is it's a bit different from Scapula, where I had really wanted to press that these characters were a bit more lively. Scapula was inspired by a lot of comic book sources, but for Scarecrow Spookshow, aside from the Calvin and Hobbes references that I'd mentioned earlier, I actually did go out and just try to look for new sources of inspiration. And one of the things I did look at was a lot of animated cartoons and a lot of comics that had that very fluid animated movement to them. One of them was Asterix, which had that almost ready for animation quality to it. And I tried to capture a lot of that, fluid motion, which is mostly what these top three poses here are all about. We have down here just a very stupid horror-related pun, but you know what? I love puns, and the more painful the pun, the better. Although my poor wife has to listen to them almost daily from me. This is a pretty bad one regarding vampires and a stakeout. I can't top the Crypt Keeper in regards to pun quality, but you know, I gave it a stab. Moving along. So the unpacking is done and another day passes as Giselle heads off to school and meets her schoolmate Crystal. Crystal was a bit more important in the pitch packet because, again, this was before Dwight came along, and I felt that Giselle needed someone to talk to besides her grandpa just to give her a little bit sort of a mental break. Now, Crystal's role was, again, a bit reduced because I had to make room for Dwight, but she did end up appearing quite a bit throughout this book anyway. She has her importance as a Giselle's school friend, even if her personality is much more fearless and confident, which I guess is sort of bring to the forefront Giselle's insecurity. For what it's worth, I think Crystal is the only Native American character I've ever done. If you like diversity, awesome. Meeting each other out front, reflecting a bit on how embarrassing our parents and grandparents are, which is the case in high school. But guys, kids, go easy on your elders. They'll be gone someday. And then you'll be embarrassed by their corpses. In the pitch packet, there was a quick little moment with meeting up with Giselle where Baron pops out of the house dressed as an octopus just to sort of spook her. It felt a little superfluous, so I left it out of the final book. Because we have something even crazier about to happen, which is the mailman. Now, I had mentioned earlier that Baron is eccentric, but I didn't want him to seem completely out of control or completely nuts, because then you would go into this comic possibly thinking he's going to do something really dumb or really dangerous. This is probably the craziest thing he does in the entire book, and whether or not it goes a little too far, it could have gone even further, but tell that to our poor mailman friend here. As Baron runs off in his jammies, scaring off poor old Mitch the mailman. Well, sorry, buddy. But that's just sort of a peek at what is ahead with Giselle and the Baron and what sort of craziness comes next. Stay tuned for Chapter 2. I really like monsters. And I hope all you kids out there do too, because we've got a doozy of a one coming up in our next chapter titled King Mongula Lives. We begin with one of the things that every artist and performer dreads: criticism. The weird thing about this newspaper clipping that a local TV critic has written about Baron DeMonte being fired, or practically his obituary, is this was part of the original Syndicate pitch packet, so this was done prior to the Zuda competition. However, the Zuda competition, as I had mentioned, did not go particularly well for me because a lot of people did not like this comic for one reason or another, and they were not shy about letting me know. Some reviewers wrote these long, hateful reviews of just this little comic strip, but this was my first experience with, random internet complaining and attacks and stuff like that. So in retrospect, I guess it was something I was going to have to learn sooner or later, but that didn't make it any easier at the time. Baron, however, takes it just a little bit better than I did, and by that he just flies right off the hook with "Fools, the blind peons!" Bah! We have a lot of big melodramatic ham acting, which is a lot of the fun with Baron, not only writing this all this florid dialogue in purple prose, but also just like the big animated gestures we have with them, the curves and the sweeps and stuff like that. Maybe I did act that out a little bit when I was drawing it. No, he's got something big planned, something big and dreadful planned, and that plan is, well, it's lunch. Baron is going to his big chest full of horrors. He's going to pull out a few bits and pieces of beasties from here and there. Half gorilla, half werewolf, and half dinosaur. So aside from the faulty fractions of that combo of creatures may sound a little familiar, and that's because it is a homage to the game Rampage. I've talked a little bit about this and its influence on me in the Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle videos. Baron, however, has got a big creature planned. What is he going to do? How is he going to make this creature? And more importantly, what is that on Giselle's shirt? Hey kids, who wants to go off on a tangent? You probably noticed that in this panel here that Giselle is wearing a t-shirt with a very familiar skull face on it. So now's as good of a time as any to talk about Scarecrow Spookshow and its relationship with Scapula. Now, as I had said in the introduction, these two series were developed side by side, and as I had also said earlier on that Scapula did have crossovers with another comic I did, which was the Underground series Dada Hyena. Does Scarecrow Spookshow exist with Scapula, and was there ever going to be a crossover intended? And that answer is a big fat no. Now, why is that? Once again, it's the influence of Calvin and Hobbes. There's a lot of things about Calvin and Hobbes' world that Bill Watterson set up that I really respect about it. Calvin and Hobbes existed in its own private world and very much about the special and private relationship between Calvin and Hobbes, and to that extent Watterson was very, very restrictive with how many distracting elements could have been introduced. I always admired the restraint that Watterson had, that he didn't overload the comic with characters like Hobbes. He could have easily added tons of other imaginary friends, talking animals and stuff like that. The cast of characters was kept very small because they existed in their importance to Calvin himself, and I really, really respect Watterson for that. Now, Scapula, of course, is a bit more inspired by Marvel Comics and things like that, and Marvel Comics, of course, existed in a big shared universe, which is why even in Ditko's Spider-Man, a bit more self-contained than a lot of the other Marvel series at the time, it still did have crossover. Spider-Man still met with Fantastic Four and the Hulk. That's just the universe that Stan Lee and the like were setting up, and that's totally fine for what works for that. But that's not really what works best for other series. Again, Calvin and Hobbes. I'm a big fan of Ditko's Spider-Man. I'm a big fan of Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. Would I ever want to see a crossover between the two of them? No, because it again goes against that world that Calvin Hobbes exists in that needs to be very much its own thing. And this is a big part of the reason why I had never really wanted to do any comics where Scapula and the Baron met each other. It's because the Baron's world and the world of Scarecrow Spookshow had to exist in its own isolated universe. Even with that said, there are still little Easter eggs that sort of hint that these two worlds sort of exist between each other, even if not directly, and even in not quite the ways you would expect with a full crossover or, God help us, a multiverse and things like that. Aside from this quick t-shirt gag with Giselle wearing the Scapula, later on in the book there is a Halloween story, and some of the kids in this Halloween story are, surprise surprise, dressed as Scapula and the sinister monster Doom Legion. Now, how does that work within the Scarecrow Spookshow's world? Maybe within this world, Scapula is is just a fictional character. Maybe it is just a comic book within that world. Maybe the t-shirt Giselle is wearing now is just a band that saw Scapula's image and helped themselves to it. Use your own imagination for that. Does Scarecrow Spookshow exist within the world of Scapula? Well, if you own the book called The Greatest Freak Show of All, take a close look at the beginning of the end of the story, because there is little Easter eggs regarding a certain TV show and a certain Baron. A lot of readers out there will be able to draw on their own conclusions and decide for themselves just how exactly Scapula and the Baron's worlds exist, or coexist if they do at all. Carry on. Okay, anyway, Baron is back to work and he's got something planned. What is it going to be? Well, whatever it is, it could use the brain of the next door cat. Kind of a grim joke, I like that. Off goes Giselle and in comes Dwight. Baron is getting on his scientist frock and Dwight is putting on a little bit of a costume, which is taking a towel, rolling up in a shirt, and making himself a homemade hunchback. That's a tad cliche, isn't it? Yes, it is. It is extremely cliche. In my drawing video for Bela Lugosi as Igor from Son of Frankenstein, I did address the long overused and very often incorrect trope of the hunchback lab assistant. Yes, it is cliched, but I don't think that's gonna stop Dwight. As for a hunch butt, well, I guess that could be a reference to about 90% of the women I draw in my comics. Sorry, not sorry. Knock that off! Baron is in full scientist mode, and as he works through the night, assembling these props together into something or other, what all it needs is a brain, a social security number, and a worthy cause. What is that worthy cause gonna be? Well, whatever it is, it's not a cartoonist. Self-deprecating humor, it's always good when you draw comics for a living. The real tragedy going on right now involves a wail from the outside yard and poor widow Scruffykins. The next door neighbors, they are digging a plot for something in a shoebox. That something is Scruffy. Herbert, for some reason, is dressed like he came out of the late 19th, early 20th century. I think I might have dressed him up like that because, for all intents and purposes right now, he's a gravedigger. And as I'm sure you can tell, what with the mad scientist frock, the hunchback, and a gravedigger, we are setting ourselves up for a great big Frankenstein scenario. I don't even need to tell you about the importance of Frankenstein, either the Mary Shelley novel, the James Whale movie, or any of the other adaptations, because that's like a huge part of the horror periodic table, so to speak. We cut ahead to our next page. Baron has raced back inside, and this is a joke that I'm not entirely sure is clear or not. It is an implied scenario, and sometimes implying that something has happened can be funnier than showing itself. Herbert and Kaylee had a little dog small enough to fit in a shoebox, Scruffy. Scruffy went They buried Scruffy. However, what Baron doesn't know is that they have gotten themselves a new dog to replace Scruffy, and that dog is a Rottweiler, which apparently has caught Baron in the act of grave digging and has chased him back to his home. Baron has the corpse inside the box there. Was that clear? I hope it was. I don't know what people would have thought if it wasn't otherwise, and hopefully didn't think like he stuffed a Rottweiler in a shoebox or whatever. Baron has absconded with Scruffy's little body. That's a very sad, grim joke to think about, so we're not going to dwell on it, and we're not going to show a dead puppy for that matter either. Let's just assume Scruffy was an evil dog and had what was coming to him. God, that's grim. In any case, we got grimmer scenarios to deal with, such as Baron's makeshift Frankenstein laboratory. He has assembled something that is underneath the blanket. He has inserted the brain of a vicious killer. Scruffy killed someone. Aha! See? See? Dwight's no liar. Scruffy was a murderer. Bad Scruffy. They said I was mad. They said I was crazy. They said I couldn't bring my own candy to the movie theater. And I don't blame them either, man. Have you seen the concession stands at movie theaters? Ugh, it's criminal. Throw the switch, my boy, as Dwight gives out a very cliched, yes, master, hee hee hee, ha ha ha. So inaccurate. Again, refer to my rant in the Igor drawing video. So a lot of this Frankenstein scenario is very basic horror 101, but you know, considering this is very early on in the book, I will live with that. Dwight throws the switch, but instead of a bunch of Kenneth Strickfaden lab equipment, we just have a light, an old-timey alarm clock, and coffee going. Rise! 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 It does not rise. Little bit of a drawing error here, not really a huge one. Baron's proportions are a little different. The proportions for the Scarecrow Spookshow characters were done very much more like a kid's cartoon as opposed to the Scapula series. As you can see with the character style guide here, Baron stands about 3.5 heads tall, which is pretty common for most animated cartoons. In this drawing though, he looks more like about 4 heads tall, stacked on top of each other, which is a little closer to a Scapula character. Whatever. The thing is not alive. Baron has given it a solid 20 minutes, and now it's time for coffee and cookies, which of course gets the attention of the thing underneath the blanket.
Chocolate or peanut butter?
Both, I believe.
I'd be right over.
There is a bit of a continuity error. You wouldn't know it at this point, but the thing under the blanket right now is using proper pronouns with I. Later on, it will be referring to itself in the third person, which means this is a bit of an error. This is also a holdover from the pitch packet material, but we are about to make a big divergence from that. Yes, whatever this thing Baron has made out of his old props has come to life. This is, in effect, the first supernatural or paranormal or fantastic element that has entered the story. So far, with Chapter 1 was entirely kind of sitcom scenario, slice of life situations, but nothing actually weird happening. Now, however, we've had the fantastic happen, and something that Baron has somehow created has come to life. How? Why? It doesn't matter. Again, going back to Calvin and Hobbes, a lot of the magic of that strip is just happens for no reason whatsoever, and trying to dissect it and explain why it happens is really, it kills it. It doesn't matter how it happens. A lot of people even just go for the simple answer and say, okay, a lot of the things that happen because of Calvin's imagination. He's just imagining Hobbes is real. He's just imagining a cardboard box is a transmogrifier or whatever. But even going by those guidelines, Bill Watterson really plays with the rules of reality a lot, where things happen that couldn't have been just in his imagination. What is the explanation for it? There is none, because it doesn't need one, because it's not that kind of comic. And that is very much what I was going for here with the Scarecrow Spookshow. Baron bringing the monster to life has no sane, logical reason to it, but it happened, and we're gonna go with it because that's our story. Our creature has come out of the shadows. It's going to attack. Oh, look out, there's a monster who kind of smells like tire rubber. What is this monster? What is it made out of? Is it made out of just props and rubber and this, that, and the other lying around? Well, let's talk a bit about this monster. Like I had said earlier, Scarecrows was developed at the same time as Scapula. Even though there wasn't any intended shared continuity or whatnot, there was a character in both versions who has more than a passing resemblance to the other. In the earliest drafts of Scarecrows, the pet monster that comes into the fray is named Throg. Now, Scapula readers, you already know who that sounds very much like in that comic, which is Throgor. The designs were very similar, their personalities were very similar too, very surly, grouchy, dominated by their stomachs. For all intents and purposes, it's practically the exact same character. I'm not entirely sure what I was thinking, because this is going back to almost 20 years ago. Those of you guys who have watched my commentary video for the 15th zine will know that a lot of the creative decisions I made are lost to time practically, because I was in my mid-20s. And as a middle-aged man, I've forgotten a lot of it. The logic with the Throg and Throgor characters might have been that it was supposed to have been sort of the same character, but two different versions or two different ways to interpret the character, if that makes sense. I don't know, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It's a very strange decision to have made, and I guess it was one that I kind of rescinded because the Throg idea was dropped and Throg became Krog or Krog, but even that felt way too close to Throgor. By this point, the Scapula series was underway and Throgor was a main character, and I was no longer interested in having sort of the same character in both comics, so it was time to really change the monster character in Scarecrow Spookshow to something more of its own. Both the character's name and the personality were given a big change. Instead of being like the grouchy Throgor clone, the monster character in this became a very, very stupid pet. It's got the brain of a little puppy, which is probably like bouncing around and probably isn't the smartest thing in the world. Now, even though the personality had been changed a bit, the design that ended up in the book is still pretty close to the Krog Throgor concept, and I'm looking at this now and it probably should have been changed a little bit more. The resemblance to Throgor, especially in Giant Attack Monsters when Throgor becomes a kaiju, is pretty close. I'm looking at this now and almost wishing that I had gone with just a very radically different design. Now, again, referring to the Giant Monsters Attack video, you guys know that I was unhappy with the Zarbonok character, and for that video, I did a completely new pass for him. For the sake of this video, I decided to do another interpretation of the character seen here. And here is my result. We have a lot more random monster movie influences thrown in there. A lot of stuff from the 1950s, Paul Blaisdell monsters and Tsuburaya and things like that. I don't know if this design is too complicated. It is very much a hodgepodge of a lot of different other creatures, but whether or not that all functions together or if it's too distracting. Would this have worked? Maybe. Would I go back and redraw it? No. As just another variation of a character who went through a lot of variations, it's just sort of food for thought, and it is nice to consider. In any case, what we got is what we got, and that is a little rattle-brained rubbery monster named King Mongula. That name must have been used for some monster concept that I never got off the ground, but it works here. Baron mentions that monsters are his profession, and here's the living proof. It's going in the fish tank. Again, how this creature's body is functioning and keeping alive when it's full of rubber and just leftover stuff from the fridge. Go back to that Calvin and Hobbes logic of how Hobbes is able to be thrown in a washing machine and come out totally fine without drowning or stuff like that. Don't think about it, just go with it. And if having beef gravy coming out of your armpits makes you sick, well, he's about to get very sick. Where is Dwight? Big cartoony expression on King Mongula here, and these are fun to draw. And a great big bleh. I'm not especially fond of barf jokes, but in this case, I guess it works fine because the emphasis is not on barf, the emphasis is on the fact that he ate Dwight! But of course, as we recollect here with Giselle and Baron, this isn't the first time Dwight has been eaten. In fact, it looks like the last time he was eaten by a cow. I don't know how or why a cow ate Dwight, but it's a case where the readers will use their imaginations to come up with something ridiculous. And I can't think of anything more ridiculous than being eaten by a cow. Baron, however, is not happy about his grandchildren being devoured. It's time you learn your place, foul creature! Mongula is just sitting there with not a thought going through that dog's brain in its head. He rolls up a newspaper and gives it a pink! Bad, bad, bad. Now, I didn't realize this when I drew it at the time, but this is a joke that is totally cribbed from the Munsters. I think I had mentioned in one of the drawing videos I've done of Munster characters, either Herman or Spot, that one of my all-time favorite jokes on the Munsters is when Herman has to reprimand Spot for being bad. He takes a newspaper, gives it a single tap, and Spot goes on a rampage and destroys everything. I was not thinking about that joke when I did this, but just by coincidence, it happened anyway, so we'll call it an homage. Now, Mongula may not have much of a brain and it may be made out of rubber, but it still does not like being punished. Mongula is running amok and they run outside, but of course the rampage is short-lived because as soon as he's got the house to himself, this drawing right here kind of cracks me up. I think it's hilarious when characters make a take to the camera or break the fourth wall. I know a lot of comedy writers and performers hate it when people do that. Me personally, I love it. Big malicious grin on his face where Mongula knows that he's won. I don't care. I do love drawing characters just looking right at the reader. Why not? Mongula's big master plan: lock them out, raid the fridge, chow down, and even destroy some of their possessions. Yeah, that's a family album and a diary shredded up on the floor. Why would he do that? Because he's being a jerk. Baron and the grandkids watch from outside. That monster! Dwight remarks that he barfed all over the rug. That line was originally, he made a mess on the rug, but I changed it just in case people thought that Mongula took a dump on the carpet. Ugh, hopefully not. Now, how do they get rid of Mongula? They don't! As you will see in later chapters of the book, Mongula is now part of the family. He's not going anywhere, probably because they couldn't chase him out of the house, but he soon becomes sort of their adopted family pet. And honestly, who could say no to the pet kaiju of their own? Good boy. Stay tuned, we got another spooky chapter ahead.
Now I'm gonna knock on the other wall. When you hear me, you knock on this wall. Lower down.
And we're back with chapter 3, and things are about to get really spooky. Isn't that right, puppy? Who's your good puppy? You go outside and play now. Now, the first two chapters, again, were culling a lot of story material that was originally done for the syndicated pitch packet. From here on in, though, all of the stories were created especially for the book, starting with Haunted House. The seemingly innocent incident, book hits the floor, but Baron knows better because he can tell, just from this one little bit of evidence, that if you've got ghosts, you've got everything. It is kind of strange to spend an entire page on just one really quick gag, but whatever, it works. Later on that day, Dwight and Giselle are reacting to Baron's news about ghosts in the house. Dwight, being Dwight, believes Baron immediately. Giselle, being Giselle, doesn't believe Baron immediately. A bit of interaction going on here with the characters, and of course, like the previous two chapters, this is entirely about just showing what kind of personalities that Baron, Giselle, and Dwight have and how they interact with each other. From chapter 4 onwards, though, we have more stories with them going off on their own. There is a Giselle chapter, there's a Dwight chapter, but for here and now it was mostly just about establishing their personalities. Baron's personality, for example, is immediately to believe that something supernatural is occurring. Giselle, of course, is just afraid that this is going to lead to further embarrassment, such as running around the neighborhood and screaming about ghosts again, which is something he only did twice. And hopefully neither of those times involved the poor mailman. Baron sends Dwight to go pick out the Ouija board? Whatever this thing is called, and I know it's derived from the French word oui, meaning yes, and the German word ja, meaning yes, and for some reason it's not pronounced oui ja, it's pronounced oui ja. Is that right? Or is that just some typical ignorant American mispronunciation of it? I don't know. If you know, feel superior than I do, because I don't know if I have to revoke my goth cred for not knowing something about the occult like that. Whatever it is, Baron is going to use it to contact the wandering spirit. Quick little bit of dialogue here where Giselle asks if the ghost wants ice cream, and Baron responds, "No ice cream for spirits!" That almost sounds like the tagline on a t-shirt. I don't know. If I ever do any Scarecrow Spookshow merchandise, I can whip out something like that. We have a quick explanation here for how a Ouija the thing works, and this is just in case if readers weren't familiar with it. Of course, kids being kids are going to immediately use it for the wrong purposes, which is going to be annoying their younger siblings. Giselle goes immediately into taunt mode and uses it to ask,
"Does Dwight pee his pants every day?"
Oh, siblings. I don't know if anyone else, if you personally watching this have had to deal with siblings. I had a great many of them growing up, and yeah, this is exactly the kind of really annoying, aggravating stuff that siblings would do to each other. Now, the nice thing about siblings, though, is that when you grow up, you never have to see them again, except for at the occasional wedding or funeral or whatever, but, oh, believe me, I had many years of going through stuff like this with just... Oh, kids are terrible. But this is also opening up just another side of Giselle's personality, that she's not always just the cynical pessimist, that she can be a bit of a brat herself. Baron, of course, is taking this very seriously, as he takes every supernatural occurrence seriously. We have a very animated pose on Baron right here, with that jaw kind of stretching out, and the big sweep of the arm, which of course is a big part of what I was saying earlier, of just wanting these characters to be as animated and lively as possible, including this very dramatic bird's eye view with the Baron raising his hand and calling out, "To any spirits present, we ask of thee, who are you?" I don't know if I should have made that like even bigger font to like really play up how much of a ham he's being right now, or I guess it works well enough. It's moving the planchette and responding, "Someone smarter than you, idiots." Now, this is kind of interesting pointing out here is that comedic timing in comics is something I talked a little bit about in Giant Attack Monsters Mega Battle. Interesting seeing it here and comparing how this gag would have played out had this been a TV show or an animated cartoon, where you would have a bit more of the timing would be drawn out, going letter by letter, spelling out "someone smarter than you idiots" saying right there. The only way I could see that working in comic form is if I were to dedicate an individual panel to every single letter it's spelling out, but even then you would just still read it right through as if those panel borders didn't exist. It would just read out almost the way it is here with the ellipses separating them. Now, Giselle, like a lot of older siblings, doesn't just want to tease her younger sibling, she also wants to blame him for everything going on, including supposedly insulting them. It wasn't Dwight, of course, it was something much worse. Dwight's not worse. Baron calls out, "I beseech thee, wandering soul, appear before us." This probably could have been done even more dramatically. I know we have the hands going on with like the huge foreshortening, but this probably could have been more of an upshot. There's some vapors or fog forming in the background, which I guess means a ghostly presence is entering, but this also could have been like dramatic uplight too. There's a little bit of that going on. It probably could have been pushed a little further. Oh well, it works well enough. The spirit is going to make its presence known, and here it is right now. What little demon have we come across? Let's talk a little bit about this ghost character, or the character it had originally intended to be. First things first is that this thing is called Spookums, but you wouldn't know that from the story itself, and that's because Spookums was originally intended to be a very different kind of character, where it would have been a regular cast member and it would have joined the family as one of their own. Sort of like how Mongula was adopted as the family pet, so to speak, in the previous chapter, Spookums would have been added to the regular cast of characters. There might have even been the plan to have like paired up Spookums with Giselle in sort of the way that Dwight and Mongula are paired up later in the book. Now the thing about that is, even though that was just an okay idea, when I was thumbnailing and sort of planning out the story beats of this chapter, it just started to seem more funny to turn Spookums into an antagonist. I know this is a family-friendly comic, it is more heartfelt than scapular or whatnot, but in the end it's a comedy, and when you're doing comedy you got to go over what you think is funnier, and in this case making Spookums a total little bastard felt much funnier than having it become friends with them eventually. This is not the kind of book that I guess really needs a villain, but in this case Spookums really being a little jerk felt much funnier than having Spookums eventually become a friend. Now Spookums' design is not really a callback to any classic monsters like Mongula and some of the other references in this book. Spookums' design, oddly enough, is inspired by Pokemon, you believe it or not. Yeah, way back in the day, I used to play the red and the blue on like my old Game Boy, which is like the size of a brick, you know, the ones with the little spinach screen. Those were fun games to play, and some of my favorite Pokemon from the first generation were the Ghosts, Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar. They had very simplistic designs, but they worked perfectly, and a lot of what I was going here with Spookums was kind of trying to emulate that very simple but very expressive kind of designs. So we have a ghost that's a childish little pest who, of course, is going to start off with the most childish little pest prank move of them all, screaming in somebody's ear. Oh, have you ever had that happen to you as a kid? Oh, kids are terrible. Off it goes. Of course, it's not gone for good. It's just making its way around for its next childish prank. The drawing of Spookums here in this first panel, that could have been a little darker, but it works well enough. The follow-up panel, though, the stare down between Spookums and Dwight. In the commentary for Gemini's Copycat Counterattack, I had mentioned there was a very cartoony expression pose between Scapula and Gemini with the big wide eyes and the big dewy pupils. And as I had mentioned in that video, this is sort of a callback to some of the Nicktoons of the 90s, in particular Rocko's Modern Life, where sometimes he would have those very exaggerated expressions. In this case, yeah, this gag could have been done, I guess, with Spookums making a scary face or showing a lot of teeth or intentionally scaring Dwight, but for some reason it just seemed a lot funnier just to make it this big dramatic stare down for no real reason. Either way, it gets the job done, because poor Dwight is out like a light. Baron's trying to keep the peace and trying to assure them that, well, maybe this ghost isn't so bad after all. Of course, the worst is yet to come as a candle starts to rise. This, of course, is a bit of a callback to a movie called Hold That Ghost, starring Abbott and Costello. I've mentioned other times before that I'm a big fan of Abbott and Costello, and I've given them quite a few homages throughout the Scapula series, but this is another just little quick one. Of course, I don't know if the floating candle gag in Hold That Ghost resulted in Lou Costello being set on fire, but in this case, it definitely does here. Fire! Pretty intense being set on fire, and even though, yes, this is cartoon violence that doesn't really have any real repercussions, just thinking about being set ablaze is a pretty cruel thing to do, so Spookums has just gone beyond childish pranks and into hardcore abuse. The dynamic being set up now with Spookums really being a little jerk and getting a kick out of it is a bit like some of the old MGM or Warner Brothers cartoons where a supposedly cute character like Tweety Bird or Jerry the Mouse would just spend an entire cartoon just torturing some other character, usually a cat. I don't know what cartoonists have against cats. It's supposedly cute and supposedly hilarious, and really all you want to do is reach into the TV and scream at that little thing. This is a bit of a twist on that, where yes, the supposedly cute character really is a little jerk. It's our protagonists who are going to be on the receiving end of it. Baron sticks his head in the toilet. I didn't want to really have too much toilet humor in this comic. I don't know, because you never know what you can get away with potty humor in kids. But I guess if you really want flat-out scatological humor, just go refer to the 10,000 Zorbanok poo-poo jokes in the Giant Attack Monsters commentary. Okay, so now Baron is wringing out his long hair like a towel. I suppose I could have done a joke about the stench that would be coming off from burning hair, but whatever. Baron, of course, comes to the conclusion that this ghost is a rotten little punk, but he's got just the thing to deal with it. A secret weapon that's being kept inside of a tiny little chest, and it's a little gimmick called Mirageovision. Ooh. Both this and the Ouija board from earlier on are homages to 13 Ghosts, which is one of my favorite ghost films of all time. This was a William Castle movie, and you guys out there who know your horror history know that William Castle was a big promoter of gimmicks that would tie in with his movies. He would have stuff like Emergo, where a skeleton is wheeled over an audience. Woo! What was the Tingler had something where, you know, the seats would be buzzed, the Tinglers loose in the theater. I forget what the name of that gimmick was. And then, of course, he'd have like the voting poll in Mr. Sardonicus, where you got to decide if the bad guy was going to get a spanking and be sent to bed without any supper or not. In the case of 13 Ghosts, the gimmick was, it wasn't really 3D glasses, it was something a little bit along those lines, where audience members were given like a special cardboard with sort of a blue film and a red film, and when the ghosts appeared on screen, you had the option of looking through the blue or looking through the red, so you could see the ghost for yourself, or if you could chicken out and not see the ghosts. And I don't know anybody who wouldn't have wanted to have seen the ghost, but whatever, it's just part of that interaction. And it ties inside the film itself, where a special pair of goggles would allow the protagonists to see the ghosts that would appear in the film. Now in this case, what do the 3D glasses do, other than look dorky? Do they look that bad? I don't know. Anyway, this will supposedly this will allow them to spot the ghost. Now, unfortunately, Spookums is way ahead of them and has conveniently reached inside a packet of 3D posters, now in 3D. I've made a comment before about intentionally redundant jokes in the Scapula 15th Anniversary Zine commentary. You can see it for yourself there, because talking about it now would be redundant. And we get a very stupid gag here, where it turns out Spookums holding up a scary poster in 3D is enough to scare the family. That's dumb, but whatever. Sometimes dumb works. This monster drawing it's whipping out here isn't like directly homaging anything. It is just sort of a callback to some of the great gross out artists like Ed Big Daddy Roth and Basil Wolverton. Spookums goes chasing them down the hallway and then helps itself to another poster showing a belly dancer. I wasn't sure if this gag was too salacious for a kid's book, young adult book, or whatnot, but whatever, it's fine. It's not revealing too much of anything. And we have a bit of a timing beat here, where it's the family is reconnoitering out in the hallway. This is just a bit of a breather in between Spookums attacks, but it's also a chance just to, again, show these characters' personalities and how they interact with each other. Dwight being Dwight immediately goes into panic mode, Giselle being Giselle immediately has a sarcastic quip, and Baron is still taking this very ludicrous situation very seriously. Quick bit of exposition that, you know, maybe the ghost is just looking for something simple. So he's gonna call out, "What is it you want?" And the ghost reaches for a piece of chalk that may or may not have been there earlier. This is a slightly self-deprecating joke where it's just pointing out, maybe it's pointing out a flaw in the comic where this chalk, was the chalk there earlier? Was it not? Who knows? Who cares? I guess it could have been drawn in earlier on at the table scene, but screw it. If you get a quick stupid gag out of it, it's worth it. So the ghost reaches for the chalk, it goes over the wall to start writing its spiritual message to them. Now, what is that message? Well, it's a pretty snotty message, appropriately enough. Now, of course, a ghost writing a chalk message on the wall is a callback to Robert Wise's classic film, The Haunting. Now, it turns out the ghost here has a lot more to say than "Help Eleanor Come Home." In this case, it's got some very childish demands and a few insults thrown in. This was a little tricky to write something that would be appropriate for a family-friendly book. You better believe that if this gag had appeared in Scapula, what the ghost would have written would have been much, much worse and much more offensive. In this case, though, these are very childish demands. To which Baron just responds, "You'll get nothing and like it, you rat!" The ghost's response is, "Yep, A pie-in-the-face gag. This has got to be one of the oldest jokes in all of existence, other than slipping on a banana peel, but whatever. In this case, it's just stupid enough to work. Baron's face is covered in pastry and frosting and whatnot, which thankfully isn't scalding him, which you'd think a pastry fresh out of the oven would do that. Instead, we get, one last Calvin and Hobbes reference for the night, and I promise this is the last one. This visual of Baron just like covered in the glop or whatever is a bit of a homage to this, to a quick Calvin and Hobbes strip where Calvin was like blowing bubble gum. It blows up in his face and he ends up as like this goopy mess with a gaping mouth. Whatever, I'm not gonna hide it. Pretty silly where Spookums has got a magical easy bake oven and like a little chef hat. Whatever, you know, sometimes stupid, silly gags work. So you've noticed, yeah, this entire story has moved at a very fast, frenetic pace, which is again playing like an animated cartoon. I don't know, maybe this was done with the hopes that Scarecrow Spookshow could be adapted to animation someday. You never know, it could be. If you'd be interested in seeing such a thing, just let me know in the comments. Who knows? I could always just go and pitch it. They reconnoiter in the hallway yet again, and Baron says, "Dash it all, I've had enough of this confounded asininity." Is asininity a bad word? Can I say that in a kid's comic? Well, he apologizes for it anyway, and he's got a plan, and it's time that they fight back. We have here these 3 quick panels. These are some of my favorite expressions from Spookums, and it's a shame I probably could have pushed some of those earlier ones further, but whatever, as long as we got 3 good expressions in the end, that's good enough for me. We begin here with this maniacal laugh of Spookums. Very Daffy Duck, very silly. Follow up with Spookums reacting to Baron entering the frame with a very malicious, come back for more, eh? Followed by Spookums' horrified reaction when Baron recites the magical incantation to drive away a ghost. Go away. Whip-imp is a sound effect that I just made up. I might have used that in Scapula before. You mean that's all we had to do? Apparently so. Yeah, comedic anticlimax, and I used to do a lot of anticlimaxes back in the Scapula webcomic days, and anticlimaxes can be risky because you really have to play against expectations and you really gotta be unpredictable. There's nothing worse than a predictable anticlimax, because then it just feels like the writer was being lazy. Does it work here? You tell me. You tell me. If this was funny to you, leave a comment below and let me know whether or not this was a funny way to dispose of the phantasmic pest. And if not, then that's upon me. Maybe I deserve a pie in the face myself. We conclude chapter 3 in our 3 chapters tonight with Dwight's very wise words, "Reading is awesome!" It most certainly is, children. It most certainly is.
Coming soon in other chapters of this very book. Baron versus the Body Snatcher. Prehistoric beasts. Giselle goes mad. The alien Santa? See it all in the book. The Scarecrow Spookshow.
And that's our show. Thank you so very much for joining us, creepy creature kids. Remember, you can pick up the Scarecrow Spookshow and all of my other books at the Scapula Bookstore, or join us in on Patreon at Scapula Comics for more frightful fun. Thank you so much, guys. Pleasant screams!
Dash it all! I swear this thing is haunted.
Take your medication, Grandpa.